I spoke to Gadi Taub on Thursday, November 7th, a conversation that I was really looking forward to. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Gadi, he is what many refer to as a provocateur, a maverick, an iconoclast. It's probably more accurate to say that he's a really smart guy with a PhD from Princeton who has been on a very public, intellectual, and ideological journey in his professional life. Moving from the center-left on the political spectrum, I think that's fair to say, to where he is today, firmly on the right. This movement along a continuum and moving rightward also happens to be quite common these days in many Western democratic countries, including Israel. Gadi Taub is a senior lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, journalist, podcaster. He is prolific in terms of output and impressively diverse in terms of content. He has written and participated in the creative process with projects ranging from the academic to television series to literature for young adults and more. Fun fact, his podcast was recently named the second most popular news and current affairs show in Israel. It is in Hebrew only and called The Gatekeepers. You should check out the podcast notes on the State of Tel Aviv site for Gadi Taub's full bio. We spoke 2 days after the U.S. election, on Thursday, November 7th, when the buzz in Israel was very, buzzy. A happy buzz, because in the Middle East, in countries that are not part of the axis of Iranian-led terror, so that means in Israel, Saudi, the UAE, and elsewhere, a Trump presidency was something that people hoped for. Please keep in mind, because I know that some of our listeners are sensitive to this point, and I am alive to that. We and I are speaking only of the impact of a Trump administration on and in the Middle East, which is myopic, perhaps, but that's where we live, and that is our lane. We, me and Gadi, are not analyzing or discussing American domestic or other foreign policy issues. After all, we only had 45 minutes. I had intended to drop this podcast within days of recording, but then Amsterdam happened. That night and the next day, and that threw off any planning. Amsterdam and everything around it just seemed more urgent. The good news is that all that Gadi and I discussed remains highly relevant. We get into Prime Minister Netanyahu's firing on Election Day in the US, no less, of Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant. Gadi's view? It should have been done a lot earlier. He should have fired the top military leaders and head of Shin Bet. They got it all wrong. As for how he judges Bibi's culpability, well, you'll have to listen to the podcast. As State of Tel Aviv listeners know, I have somewhat different views from Gadi on many of these issues. So what? Now, more than ever, as we see the very rapid erosion of any ability for people to engage with the other, I am committed to doing exactly this, speaking with and listening, especially to someone so knowledgeable and committed to thinking things through and getting them right. And today, that someone is Gadi Taub. Open intellectual engagement used to be standard practice in life, to promote good faith discussion and debate with people holding varied opinions. Now it has become anomalous, very anomalous. We all have to fix that. For the last year, Israelis have been living moment to moment. It's not as if everything is light and breezy now, but of necessity, we are all muddling our way through these challenging times. Living on a knife edge is draining. And at State of Tel Aviv, that means we will look at issues related to this ongoing state of crisis, like the economy, like the extreme burden borne by families who serve, where fathers and husbands have been absent for so much of the past year. The fortunate families see their loved ones return, but there are far too many bereaved, and the toll on all is enormous. As I've mentioned in recent podcast episodes, I am now living on a kibbutz in the western Negev desert. We have been building housing here and enhancing community facilities and infrastructure at a frenetic pace in order to provide stable accommodations for the displaced members of kibbutz Kfar Aza, which was one of the most brutalized on October 7th. This massive project is one of many around the country, and just one example of the issues we will focus on in the coming months. Then again, we can plan all we want, but in these parts, one never knows what tomorrow may bring. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now trying to make sense of it all. Stay with us. Thursday afternoon in Israel, Professor Gadi Taub, so delighted to welcome you to the State of Tel Aviv podcast for the first time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I was just catching up on your most recent work, your podcast, which is called The Gatekeepers in English, but it is in Hebrew. And didn't you just get number 2 or something, second most popular in Israel after Channel 12?
Yeah, not after the channel, but after Channel 12's daily podcast. So there's a site that does the rating for podcasts. It's called Geek Time, and they have categories. So in categories of news and commentary, my podcast is the second most popular. It's certainly the first conservative podcast, but I started this against the background of my laundry cabinet in the corridor in the days of Corona with very rudimentary equipment, and it became a thing. And I guess the greatest achievement that this podcast has is that this is the only forum in which Yariv Levin introduced his now defunct judicial reform. He had a brief press conference of 10 minutes, and he had 1 hour and 10 minutes in my podcast in which he laid it out in detail. And that's significant because a lot of politicians in Israel on the right don't trust the mainstream media anymore. And so these outlets are like, it's like, I'm not comparing my humble podcast to Joe Rogan, but these forums became a real alternative to the mainstream media.
Indeed. And I think that's a phenomenon not just in Israel, but in many democratic countries. And congratulations for that. I'd love to have you back on in the future to get down into the weeds of judicial reform, because I think you and I would have a very feisty discussion about that. But today, I'd like to focus with you on the quite dramatic events that transpired over the last few days this week. One, in Israel, I want to talk about the firing of Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But before I get to that, what everyone wants to hear, and I certainly want to hear, is your assessment of what President Trump's or President-elect Trump's resounding victory on Tuesday, what it portends, what it may mean for the Middle East.
It's a sea change for us. Ever since this war began, for the first time in my lifetime, I thought that the existence of the state of Israel is actually in real peril. And that peril all stems from a misguided American policy. We woke up to it on October 7th of 2023, but it's been in the making for a while. Since the minute President Joe Biden came to the White House, they began to loosen the sanctions, and Iran's rise to regional hegemony took a sharp turn and was greatly intensified. And this was such a huge dark cloud on the horizon because Iran is going to go nuclear. And it seemed to have a valid strategy to destroy Israel in a war of attrition under a nuclear umbrella. And the American administration just kept on its appeasement policy and its conception of regional integration and de-escalation, guided by the wrong-headed idea that you can pacify Iran by appeasing it. And this was mortal danger. And Benjamin Netanyahu, slowly and in a sophisticated way, he's one of the most sophisticated players on the international scene. What he did was begin to leverage the war in Gaza, which he rightly interpreted as one act in the Israeli-Iranian war, not an act in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and to leverage this through Lebanon into a showdown with Iran, which he hoped the United States would eventually support. We reached all the way to a showdown with Iran after the United States threw us under the bus, basically. People are so impressed with how the American administration gave us Interceptor and how it helped protect us. But we are their chief ally in the Middle East, and they did nothing to deter Iran. When Iran is threatening your ally, you should not say to your ally, oh, we'll help protect you. You should say to Iran, you're going to pay a hell of a price for attacking our ally, because this is like attacking us. This is like attacking the alliance structure on which American security rests. And they did not do that. Very clearly, Trump's policy is different. I had Secretary Mike Pompeo on my podcast just after he left office, and I asked him, what is the difference between the Trump administration's policy in the Middle East and the new Democratic administration of Joe Biden? And he said three things. One, Iran is the problem, not the solution. Secondly, you need to bypass the Palestinian veto on the peace process in order to create a coalition to contain Iran. And thirdly, you need a credible threat that is a large enough American force to deter aggression against American alliances. I'm beefing up his short remarks, but these are the three rudiments that he enumerated. And clearly this is their thinking, and this is Trump's thinking. And if you need to compare worldviews, you would say that the progressive Democrats think that de-escalation and appeasement is the way to peace. And the Trump administration's frame of mind is that deterrence is the way for peace. And therefore, Trump was always willing to use force in order to preserve peace. And this is why he hit Qasem Soleimani. And that had a ripple effect all over the Middle East. So I don't know to what extent American support would go, to what lengths. I'm sure that the Trump administration would not want American boots on the ground. But as Mike Duran, my co-host, and I said in an article when I used to work in Haaretz before they closed down my column for supporting the judicial reform, and Mike and I wrote a piece that said, in the vein of Winston Churchill to Roosevelt, give us the tools and we'll finish the job. You don't need to do the work yourselves, but just give us the strategic support and the diplomatic support and the material, and we will do the job.
And I was just listening a little while ago to your podcast, I believe it was yesterday, that most recent episode, in which you made a really important point that I think bears repeating here, that when people hear Trump say, I don't want wars, I'm going to end wars, wars are bad, he's not saying, I don't want to use American power. In fact, what he's saying is, I will use power. I understand what American power is, and I understand the incredible deterrent capability that it has, which is what you were just saying when you're referring to your conversation with Pompeo. And I think that when Donald Trump says that, people pay attention. And the most graphic example of that, in my view, or one of the clearest, is when Obama threatened the Assad regime in 2013, if you use chemical weapons, we're going to hit you hard. And then he went fetal. And then, a few years later, the same thing happens with Trump in power. And guess what? He actually followed through.
Exactly. And also, people here were very concerned about when he said he wants the war to end. But there is a very big difference between the way he wants it to end and the way the American administration, the current administration, is saying it wants it to end, because Kamala Harris and Biden and Blinken keep saying we support Israel's right to defend itself. But that is always end the war now, ceasefire. And ceasefire is surrender. This administration was working to end this war with Hamas still on its feet in Gaza, because all it has in mind is how to bring back the two-state solution. And so I think in Blinken's mind, he sees himself like Henry Kissinger at the end of the Yom Kippur War, where the American administration prevented Israel from finishing off the third Egyptian army so that the Egyptians could save face and then be able to approach the negotiation table without being humiliated. And so I think Blinken was trying to do the same thing. He said, enough, you hit them enough. Now leave something so that they can go back to the negotiating table. But for Israelis, you probably noticed since you're here, Israelis call Hamas Nazis. We don't want the Nazis to come back to the table. We want the Nazis to be eradicated, and for everyone in the region to remember that if you burn Jewish families alive, you will not survive that, you and your organization.
I want to just go back to what you said earlier with respect to this kind of approach of appeasement that prevailed under the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. But in fairness, that appeasement really took hold and root under Obama. Okay. So, we can't lay the whole mess at the feet of Biden.
Sure. Obama is the architect and Obama is still in control.
Exactly. But there's another aspect to this, and that is the containment theory that was really, whether it was conceived by Netanyahu, I don't know, but he was certainly a very enthusiastic proponent of this containment theory, and which more or less said, I think that Hamas and Sinwar and all of the Hamas leadership, they actually are more interested in demonstrating that they can govern and provide a decent life and opportunity for their people. And I'm going to be very succinct and overly simplify this. The basic approach was keep UNRWA alive because we need them to provide whatever aid and stuff they do. Allow Qatar, I got big problems with Qatar, allow Qatar to bring in bags of cash every month to keep Hamas afloat, and allow tens of thousands of people, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, to enter Israel on a daily or weekly basis in order to earn a living. And they can earn a significantly higher amount in Israel. And this containment theory seems to have pervaded and permeated not only the upper echelons of political leadership, but also military leadership believed this was working to the point that it continued until October 7th. And anything that was done that might have suggested Hamas isn't really so interested in the welfare of their people was ignored. Talk a bit about how that weaves into the appeasement approach.
Yeah, this is, I think, I just wrote a piece for Mosaic saying that the false conception which have blinded us to the coming disaster are like a Russian matryoshka doll. There are small concrete things wrapped up in larger conceptions, and all of them are enveloped in one big doll, which is a Western conception, one of the Western conceptions of human nature, which assumes that humans are basically economic being, homo economicus, and therefore that they are rational agents seeking to improve their material lot, wanting to put food on the table, a decent job, and a safe environment to grow your children, right? This is what Obama kept telling us that everyone wants. And all this Qatari money thing, the Qatari money is a great exaggeration. Some economists now calculated that it's about 4% of the foreign aid that Hamas was getting to the Strip, but it was all rooted in a conception that says that this is how we achieve deterrence. We provide enough economic sustenance to give them a stake in the game, and then whenever they exaggerate, we give them a hit on the nose with our rolled newspaper, and that would tame the beast of Hamas or the Palestinian radicalism. And that is all built on the assumption that this is their motivation. And that was never the case. We just, we don't take them seriously. And especially, under identity politics, because we just assume that they are exactly like us. And if we are a Western society in search of material betterment, then so are they. And maybe they're a little angry or maybe they're a little deprived, but once they received minimal material conditions, improving their standard of living, they will never give it up because we wouldn't. But they are religious fanatics, and we underestimated the depth of their fanaticism, and they are willing to die for the holy grail of killing Jews. And they think they will go to heaven for it. And Yahya Sinwar was willing to sacrifice his own life, his children, his people, not to mention economic well-being, if he could destroy Zionism, which I think he thought he was able to, or that this would be the beginning of. It got much further than we imagined. But I'll tell you how it works in reality, because the head of the INSS, this think tank that is with an American orientation for the Democratic Party, Tamir Heyman, was the chief of the IDF intelligence. He's a former chief of IDF intelligence, which in Israel is also the director of national intelligence. And 2 months before the war, he had a talk at the INSS, and he said, I'm getting calls of people worried that a war is coming 2 months before October 7th. And he said, a war isn't coming. And I don't even have to look at the intelligence because I know what the interests are. So if you think you know the map of interests and you don't look at the intelligence, then, buddy, you're going to make that kind of mistake. And they all did. And so are the elected politicians also implicated in this? Of course they are. Yes, they are. They believed their military underlings, but they shared the conception that this was working. I'll have to qualify this when we come to Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu was actually the least susceptible to that. But he found himself in a situation when there was no alternative. So I can't tell you to what extent he believed that this was working. Obviously, to some extent, he was implementing this, but he never had political cachet to enter Gaza with ground forces and remove Hamas. Notice how quickly international and Israeli legitimacy evaporated. International legitimacy evaporated. Legitimacy within Israel was shaken just a few weeks after October 7th. So there really was no option. Once you inherited the cardinal mistake of unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, I supported that. So I'm confessing my own mistake. We thought that if we let them alone...
But you've had a kind of, rebirth since then, have you not, politically?
A change of mind. I don't know that I was born again, but I did have a change of mind, and it was gradual. And in the end now, I see that my own calculations rested on the assumption that once we leave them alone, this fanatic frame of mind will lose the source of the inflammation. Because once they have a nice, sedate life, they will abandon their Armageddon dreams, but they never did.
I just want to add to your comment about Tamir Heyman saying 2 months earlier, like, you guys are all wrong, forget it. Pretty sure that it was less than a week before October 7th that Amos Yadlin was also speaking, I believe, in D.C. at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and saying something very similar.
He's also an INSS guy.
I know, that's why I raised it.
And this is exactly the establishment, and they're always in codes with the Democratic Party, which I mentioned is the party of appeasement. And they all believed in that, and I don't see that they feel any remorse. I don't see that they are having a change of heart. They see this as a bump in the road, and it's a sea change. Anyone who is now calculating that removing Netanyahu will help bring about a moderate coalition is gravely mistaken. We will, in the not so far future, look back, if this war is not decisively won soon, we would be looking back at this coalition and say, do you remember Netanyahu's moderate coalition that he had on October 7th? Because the whole of the Israeli public is moving to the right.
You just segued into the possibility or the scenario that in the not too distant future, we may look back on the good old days of the moderate Netanyahu government that we live with today. And I'm really interested in hearing not just about that, but obviously it gives us an opportunity to discuss the firing of Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant. On Tuesday night, at
Yeah.
8 p.m. For our listeners who may not be aware, 8 p.m. is when, 70% of Israelis sit down to watch the nightly news. Very tactically timed, of course. And last time he fired Gallant, which was March 23, he neglected to sign the letter, which is required by law, saying you're fired. This time, of course, he did sign the 2 or 3 line letter saying you're fired, issued a copy of that to the media. And 3 hours later, Yoav Gallant made a brief statement. I think it was like an 8-minute press conference that I thought was very powerful. You have spoken out, certainly on Twitter and elsewhere, about the firing of Gallant. And I'd love you to tell us why he did that and what you think about that particular move.
Yeah, the first comment I have on that is better late than never. Yoav Gallant should have been fired long ago. I was sorry that he was taken back after the collapse of the reform. And people here think of Gallant as an agent of an American administration, which is adversarial. And so the prime minister has an adversarial minister of security, which we call minister of defense, but it returns as security. He has an adversarial minister of security who also leaks to the press constantly. So he undermines the position of the cabinet in which he is serving, often in the service or seemingly in the service of an American administration. So when Netanyahu has a position in the negotiations about the hostage deal that never was, Hamas never agreed to any of their hostage deals, but there were suggestions. And one suggestion included Israeli withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border with Egypt, which we need in order to isolate Hamas from the Arab world so we can defeat it. And while this was the position the government was taking in the negotiations, Minister Gallant is saying that maybe the Philadelphia corridor is unnecessary. So whether that's true or not, if this is the position the government is taking in its negotiations with Hamas, you should help it play poker, even if that's not the real position. You can't.
Okay, and let me jump in and interject here, because I think that, if we were keeping a scoreboard of who leaks more, we'd probably have a draw. Okay, it's a way of life here in Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu's team leaks to the media often. And, when I love...
in the service of the cabinet's position. It doesn't undermine its own position.
Well, it's in the service of his political position.
No, in service of what he thinks is Israel's interest.
He's the best political chess player in the world. So when he leaks, it's not, I'm going to push back on that. I can't accept that any politician is always going to leak only in the highest national interest. And in particular, in my view, Benjamin Netanyahu is someone who's demonstrated that he's got a very sharp sense of self-interest. So let's just say there's a balance.
No, I'm not willing to say that because I think these terms are confusing. People are speaking as if there is a contradiction between his personal political survival and Israel's interest. His political survival depends on winning this war, which is what the majority of Israelis want and what the coalition feels that it is tasked by its voters to do. So his political survival depends on his achievement of what the Israeli electorate wants. And the attempt to portray these as two opposing poles is the constant miscalculation of all his opponents. Look what happened to Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz wisely entered the coalition in support of an emergency government to fight this war. And then the minute he left it, people said, this is your political calculation at the expense of the national interest. So clearly, people see the national interest as winning this war. Netanyahu, if Israel is to lose this war, Netanyahu would be gone in an instant. And so I'm not very picky about how we define this as his own interest, because this is how democratic politics operate. A politician's interest is in serving the will of the electorate that chose him. Once he strays from that, his political career is very likely over.
And winning this war, which Netanyahu tends these days to put in terms of total victory, and I'll just say not quite sure what that means, but winning the war in terms of the hostages and bringing the hostages home, dead or alive, ASAP. Do you consider that to be an important element of winning the war?
Absolutely. This is one of the three original war aims. The war aims were extended to include returning the evacuees from the north. But this is one of the three war aims. The opposition keeps portraying victory in opposition to a hostage deal. Netanyahu doesn't think it is. If he had any way to return the hostages without total victory, then he would have scored many points in the eyes of many Israelis beyond his immediate supporters. So it would certainly be in his interest to do this. But what they're saying is his interest is to prolong the war, because as long as the war is prolonged, he stays in power. I disagree. I think that he needs to win the war. And if he does, he will likely win another election if he runs. And that he believes that returning the hostages, the way to do it is not by surrendering, which is what some of the opposition demand, despite the fact that there is no Hamas promise that if we surrender, we will get the hostages. So the whole argument is a political game, and nobody even knows who is holding the hostages in Gaza. Nobody knows. We don't even know that Hamas is able to deliver on a deal. And so what Netanyahu's strategy was, if we break Hamas and we kill the Yahya Sinwar, then we will be able to fragment it. And once we fragment it, there will be a new open way to return the hostages if, as the prime minister said in the press conference in the immediate aftermath of the Sinwar hit, he said, any local Hamas commander holding hostages will be granted safe passage out of Gaza. And the idea is, if they no longer play as a team, if there is indeed a team that's holding the hostages, it is easier for the state of Israel to apply pressure and fragment Hamas, because dealing with each local commander would be much easier than dealing with a fanatic head of Hamas, which has no interest in returning the hostages because they are his guarantee for his own life. So the whole talk of a deal, and as if Netanyahu, just because of his political machinations, undermined it, is, I find, unconvincing.
So in the few minutes we have left, I want to ask you this. Since you mentioned the Philadelphia corridor, Israel did not go into the Philadelphia corridor or take it until quite late in the war. I think it was May 21st, was certainly that week. And, so there are questions with respect to the overall strategy. Well, why did we go into Gaza the way we did? But we don't have time to get into all of that. What we do know is that Israel went into the southern strip and took control of Philadelphia that third week of May. We also know that starting in late June, early July, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, the Minister of Defense, and the Chief of Staff for the IDF, Herzi Halevi, all four of those gentlemen publicly stated that we don't need to control Philadelphia. We need to get the hostages out now while we have a chance of getting them out alive. And they've maintained that position. Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I expect you're going to suggest that this is that same kind of cabal subverting the will of the government, right?
Exactly. Yeah. These are the defeatists who wanted to end the war without victory. They showed a complete lack of judgment on the fateful night between the 6th and the 7th of October, where they did not alert the prime minister to the coming attack. They all went to sleep because they completely misunderstand our enemies and are dabbling with strategy, which is not their business. And I think the head of the Mossad was not exactly on board with that team, but they have been, I'd say, the dovish side of the spectrum and clearly misunderstood. Now that we know what was under the Philadelphia corridor, we know that it was a serious mistake not to go in there first. And this is also should be laid out to the feet of Netanyahu himself. Why did you not insist of going first into the Philadelphia corridor? Because you don't need to be a great military strategist to understand that there is a whole Arab world through which Iran is channeling war material into the Gaza Strip. That's their oxygen supply. Why did we not cut that first? I have no answer.
And neither do I, because the existence of those tunnels and how critically important they were to Hamas survival economically, militarily, in every possible way has been known for well over a decade here.
Yeah. But the Americans didn't want us to go in, and Herzi Halevi, the head of Shabak, Ronen Bar, and Gallant all agreed with the American position, which was, I guess, became defunct once we caught Yahya Sinwar because we had the Philadelphia corridor. So they were all proven wrong, and they are proven wrong again and again. And it is my regret that Netanyahu did not fire all those who failed on October 7th, because, of course, he bears responsibility being at the head of this system. But he was the one that quickly realized the mistake and changed course. And they did not. And he should have fired all of them and replaced them with people like Ofer Winter, who are not educated in American progressive universities.
The fact is, we know that there are kind of, backroom contacts constantly between the Israeli government and key mediator types with Qatar. Mm-hmm. We know that the Israeli government agreed to, whether the amount of money is exaggerated or not, in principle, to allow Qatar to enter the Gaza Strip for years with literally suitcases full of cash. And Netanyahu supported that, right? Netanyahu was also very aware, as we just discussed, of the Philadelphia corridor and what was going on there, as was Egypt, right? And we also know that the Egyptian military, the kind of lower level officers, were making some nice money on the side by supporting those terror tunnels. So everyone gets a little messy. Like if I look at Netanyahu and you say, well, he knew right away, they didn't brief him on the night of the 6th. He wakes up on the 7th and all hell has broken loose. He should have fired everybody and forged on. Well, weren't his hands a little dirty too?
I don't know why everybody's so interested in this question. Israelis are not. I mean, the opposition is, clearly. But Israelis are going to ask very serious questions of Netanyahu after this war is over. But now they're only interested in one thing, victory. And so Netanyahu, as you said, the most seasoned politician, the most sophisticated chess player around, realized that the first minute of the war, and as I said, this converges with Israel's national interest. And he has been saying one thing, total victory. From day one, he kept saying that. And so Israelis will never replace the one person insisting on total victory with the others wanting to surrender, wanting to end the war without victory in a hostage deal, saying like Benny Gantz, well, we'll end the war now and we'll start it over in a year or two. All these things are irrelevant. So whether Netanyahu will be blamed at the end of this by whatever commission of inquiry is finally set up is the less interesting question. And it seems like Israeli politics are dominated by an obsession with Netanyahu. Some people, and I'm referring, of course, to the constant demonstrators, just their excuses change. But their one major goal is to take down Netanyahu. And if you look at the Kaplan demonstrators after the war began, I have this quote, which I put on my podcast, of a very civilized-looking financial investor talking in some Kaplan conference that they had and saying, well, Hamas is the smaller problem. The real big problem is Benjamin Netanyahu. And so some of these people want to end the war with defeat only because they think that this will oust Netanyahu in the end. And they think we can deal with Hamas later. Well, this is the one chance and we shouldn't lose it.
Gadi Taub, thank you so much. I look forward to continuing this discussion and getting into many other issues, but I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
I so enjoyed that conversation. It was a bit shorter than we'd planned because we were both so pressed for time. That was a crazy week, even for crazy Israel. But Gadi Taub and I will continue this discussion in the future. I'm particularly keen to speak with him about judicial reform. He's an enthusiastic advocate of the reform proposals that, for now, are sitting on the desk of the Minister of Justice, Yoav Gallant. I believe that reform is needed, but I do not support some of the substantive changes that were before the Knesset, and I thought that the manner in which the whole project was undertaken was just disastrous and avoidable. But we'll get to that soon. In the meantime, we still have to get through this war on 7 fronts. Thanks, as always, for being here. Until next time, stay safe. Please follow us at State of Tel Aviv on Insta, and on X, formerly Twitter, we are at State of TLV. Don't be shy. Like us on our site, like us on Spotify, on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. Rate us, write a review. It really does help to give us a lift. Take a moment to support us in that way. We'll be very grateful. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.